Africa, from the northern parts to the central areas of Kilwa, as seen in these videos, and down to the south, is a very interesting area of study. Now, if we focus first on Kilwa, what we can see is that there was a general and a acceptance of excellence in this region. We don't need to, but I could show an image of it. But people like Ibn Battuta mention that the majority of this population were jet black. Now, does that mean anything to anybody? Well, to me, it means a lot, and I'll tell you why. Because all the surrounding cities around this area, whether they were Muslim, Christian, or non Muslim, had a similar lifestyle to those people. And I think the one I should start with is Somalia. We should start with Mogadishu. And of course, some of you are going to say, why? Well, the reason is because Mogadishu is one of those places where we have historical records talking about people from Mogadishu going as far as Korea, because Muslims traveled as far as Korea. And using that type of knowledge, we know that in isolated incidences, they made it all the way to Japan. If you understand what I'm saying, I'm telling you that the Muslims of East Africa traveled in the ninth century. Hear what I'm saying? In the ninth century, they traveled to Korea, and there's written record both in Korea and in Muslim records. Now, Mogadishu was found in the 10th century, but it was not a vacant spot before the city was named Mogadishu and basically altered to become as successful as it became. So, what we have to talk about is three people. Right now, I'm going to talk about three people, and I'm going to show you written records that show these three people are called Mogadishu. Mogadishu is the real word of Mogadishu, well, the Arabic word of Mogadishu. And they show that one of them, who's a jurist, is in China. Remember how old this is. We're not talking about 1700s, we're not talking about 1600s. We're talking about 1100s to about the 1300s. One of them is in China, one of them is off of an island near India, and the other one is somewhere in Africa, but is shown to play a giant role in transporting people around the world. Why is that important? Well, the reason why that's important is because after that we have all these other islands like Madagascar, and we start seeing other people from those islands as well doing the same thing, meaning that East Africa in general, probably more than other places in the world, is more fascinating in its abilities at the time. It didn't matter what religion they worshipped. A lot of them were pagan. A lot of them were not Muslim at all, who lived both in Mogadishu, Kilwa, Mombasa, Sofala, Great Zimbabwe, and more. Yet they pushed for advancement, because some people don't understand that the Bantu religions were competing and holding their ground against modern religions at the time. Mogadishu, which is a town of enormous size, its inhabitants are merchants possessed of vast resources. They own large numbers of camels, of which they slaughter hundreds every day for food, and also have quantities of sheep. In this place are manufactured the woven fabrics called after it, which are unequaled and exported from it to Egypt and elsewhere. It is custom of the people of this town that when a vessel reaches the anchorage, the sumbuks, which are small boats, come out to it. In each sumbuk there are a number of young men of the town, each one of whom brings a covered platter containing food and presents it to one of the other merchants on the ship, saying, "This is my guest," and each of the others does the same. The merchants, on disembarking, goes only to the town house of his host among the young men, except those of them who have made frequent journeys to the towns and have gained some acquaintance with its inhabitants. These lodge where they please. When he takes up residence with his host, the latter sells his goods for him and buys for him, and if anyone buys anything from him at too low a price or sells to him in the absence of his host, that sale is held invalid by them. This practice is a profitable one for them. So that's just a small description by Ibn Battuta, 1300s, of Mogadishu, and you can see that's a very organized place. It's not just a place that exists where you're like, oh, it's the houses are loosely resemble civilization or whatever. We're talking about a large infrastructure, a large settlement that is really the envy of the world for a lot of Arabs. And in fact, a lot of Arabs wanted it to be part of their domain, part of their steads. Before we move on to Kilwa and how they were mentioned, let's first mention the three people from Mogadishu. Mogadishu. I just wanted to show you that that word is exactly the same as Mogadishu, that these people are explained in this. So it says here, I met in this mosque a pious jurist from Mogadishu called Saeed, of fine figure and character. He used to fast continually, and I was told that he studied at Mecca for 14 years, and for the same length of time at Al Madinah had met Abu Namir and Amir of Mecca and Mansur Jamaz, the Amir of Al Madinah, and had traveled in India and China. Before I read the next one, I want to direct your attention to the map at the side. You can see there it's written the Maldives. So, like I said, we're going to look at a different Mogadishu, person from Mogadishu, and I want you to look at that place written Maldives. You see that it's closer to India than it is to Africa. So, we're going to read right now. This is a reading from Ibn Battuta. I opened the Quran and found the angels will descend to them, saying, "Do not be afraid and do not grieve." I asked God's blessing and set out. After 10 days, I reached the Maldive Islands and landed in Canalus. Its governor, Abd al-Aziz of Mogadishu, treated me with honor, offered me hospitality, and prepared a kandura for me. After I reached Hululi, which is the island to which the Sultana and her sisters go to relax and swim. So you can see here the second one, and this is why I'm telling you that Mogadishu was just at this time related 100% to places like India and China. It was an easy move for them to go there. We have two people. One went to China just to visit. The other one is a sultan, but he was of Mogadishu, but he was a sultan of the Maldives, which are close to Sri Lanka, Ceylon, which is what Sri Lanka used to be called. So this is the difference, right? Africa used to just travel to China and all these places. And like I said before, the Portuguese, when they traveled to Japan, they enlisted the help of the East Africans because the East Africans understood the winds and the oceans at the time, because they had traveled back and forth, and you could take 3 years to go to India if you go in the wrong season. meaning that the winds are gonna blow you back and back and back, and then when you finally get there, you're like, what the hell? Meanwhile, in other cases, it could take you, I don't know, a couple weeks, couple days, if you go at the right time and let the winds push you there. Now that's all fine and dandy, but how far back does this go? Well, in order to find this out, we have to go to Al Masudi. This is trying to draw this similarity or this connection between India, China, and the Abyssinians or Mogadishu. Like I said, Mogadishu was founded in the 10th century, but before this, there was still um, Abyssinia, who go back a couple thousands of years, which you can see is written about by Al Masudi, who writes, estimates have been made respecting the extent of the Indian Sea, which is identical with the Abyssinian Sea. Its length from the most western part of Abyssinia as far as China in the east is 8,000 miles, and its breadth is in one place 2,700, and in another 1,900 miles, for it varies in different places. These dimensions have been disputed, but we will not enter into the different statements, because there are no proofs upon which they rest. This is the greatest sea of the habitable world. It has a gulf extending from Abyssinia as far as the Barbaria, a country situated between the territory of the Zanj and the Abyssinians. This gulf is called the Barbarian Gulf. It is 500 miles long, and at the beginning and end 100 miles wide. These are not the Berbers who live west of Africa, for that is a different country altogether. It has the same name, although it has the same name. The sailors of Oman go on this sea as far as the island of Kanbalu, in the sea of the Zanj. This island is inhabited by Muslims and by Zanj, who have not embraced the Islam. The sailors of Oman, to whom we have just alluded, believe that this gulf, which is called the Barbarian Gulf, and with them the Sea of the Berbers, and of the country of Jofuni, is much greater than we have said. The waves of the sea are huge, like high mountains. Okay, so we don't need to read really any further, but I will. Anyone who's not interested can skip, but I think we should read this whole thing. These are blind waves. This term means waves which rise as high as mountains and between which abysses open like the deepest valleys, but they do not break. Hence, no foam is created like that produced by the collision of the waves in the other seas. They believe that these waves are enchanted. The sailors of Oman who sail on this sea are Arabs of the tribe of El Azd, and when they are on the board a ship, sometimes lifted up by these waves, and then again sinking between them, they say verses whilst they are at work, as O Barbaria and Jofuni, and thy enchanted waves, Jofuni and Barbaria, and their waves, as thou seest them. These sailors go on the sea of Ezanj as far as the island of Kanbalu and Sofala of the Demdema, which is on the extremity. Now, I want to be clear about this. This is another connection between the extremities, because Oman is very far away from Africa, but close to India again. Still sticking to Al Masudi, we continue as we see him talk about these people in more detail, and you'll notice how by this time we already are seeing, the connection between India and all these other places, which, by the way, was mentioned in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. We're talking about a couple hundreds of years back before this moment. So this isn't even the earliest. This is just showing you these specific kingdoms. Okay, so let's just start here. It proceeds flowing through that part of the country of Sudan which borders on the country of the Zanj, and a branch goes off it into the Sea of the Zanj. This is the sea of the island Kanbalu, which is cultivated, and the inhabitants are Muslims, but they speak the Zanji language. The Mohammedans have conquered this island and made the inhabitants prisoners, just as they have taken the Isle of Crete. So you see here, they're talking about a native population that converted to Islam, and they still speak a Zanji language. They don't speak Arabic, and they basically have converted the people of this island into Muslims. But you could tell with other things, this place was already sophisticated before they got there. It's just now with the introduction of Islam, it goes in an Islamic bend. The comparison with Crete is not a small one, because of course the same thing happened to Crete, even though Crete has a civilization that goes back a couple thousand years. And of course, the inhabitants of Crete are mixed. But let's first come back to a certain point. Everything I've mentioned so far has nothing to do with Portuguese. The Portuguese haven't landed in these areas yet. Everything I'm talking about is two groups that are in this region. One, the black native Africans, and two, the foreign Arabs, and they're a minority. Well, how do I know? Well, we can read it from Ibn Battuta. A couple of things to keep in mind while reading this is even in the time of Al Masudi, the 900s, you could tell that the majority of the population was still Zanj and they were speaking Zanji languages. And now we're going to read from Ibn Battuta, which is from the 1300s. And so we see here, if one intends to make an ablution, he holds a vessel between his thighs and pours on his hands and performs the ritual washing. All the people walk with bare feet. We stayed one night in this island and sailed on to the city of Kulwa, a large city on the seacoast, most of whose inhabitants are Zinj, jet black in color. They have tattoo marks on their faces, just as they are on the faces of the, which is not important, but it basically tells you that. So we go from Mogadishu to another island. He's probably speaking about Kanbula, but with a different name, and then to Kulwa or Kilwa, and he talks about how the people of Kilwa are jet black, the majority. But remember, Kilwa was not settled during Ibn Battuta's time. It happened before that, even before um, Masudi, who is hundreds of years before Ibn Battuta. So this is a long held area, and the population did not change for hundreds of years. And even today, I mean, still black people. And estimates say there was 11,000 people living on this island. So let's just read the whole thing quickly. I then sailed from the city of Mogadishu, that was the main point, making for the country of the Swahilis, with the object of visiting the city of Kulwa in the land of the Zinj people. We came to the island of Mombasa, a large island 2 days' journey of the Sea of Swahili country. It has no mainland territory, and its trees are the banana, the lemon, the citron. Its people have a fruit which they call jamun, resembling an olive and with a stone like its stone. The inhabitants of this island sow no grain, and it has to be transported to them from the Swahili. Their food, the food consists mostly of bananas and fish. They are Shafits in right, pious, honorable, and upright, and their mosques are made of wood. admirably constructed at each of the gates of the mosques. There are one or two wells, and they draw up water from them in a wooden vessel into which has been fixed a thin stick of length of 1 cubit. The ground round the well and the mosque is paved. Anyone who intends to go into the mosque washes his feet, and then we get back to where I started. But this is Kulwa, this is the coast. And remember, this coast is still connected to India, China, ultimately Korea. Abu Ishaq Ibrahim ibn Muhammad al Farisi al Istakri was a person who was a map maker and a writer of history, and he wrote a couple books about different cities around the world, including some of the ones that we've already talked about. But he is the oldest person to write about Korea, meaning that we know that Korea was connected with the Muslim world. And not only that, we know that there were several Muslims in Korea who were living at the time. And the funny part is, we have Eastern documents of this, meaning we have documents in Korea of this as well. But first, let's read UNESCO. This is from UNESCO. Of 20 writings by 11 Muslim scholars of the medieval age concerning Silla, 10 sources by 9 scholars, Ibn Kardabin, Masudi, and others, contain records of advance of Muslims onto the Korean peninsula and their activities, the oldest extant record being not only the first remark on the Korean peninsula, but also a mention of a settlement of Muslims on the Korean peninsula, is Ibn Kurdaba's General Survey of Roads and Kingdoms. The book, seemingly with the first edition in 846 to 847, and the second edition in 885 respectively, was something like an official guide book of geography, being the oldest bibliographical source in geography extant today. The book contains detailed information about major places of settlement, trading routes, and trading goods in many parts of the world. It also contains comprehensive knowledge about East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and the like. Two passages about the advance made by Muslim to the Korean peninsula and their settlement are as follows, though their contents are somewhat similar to one another. Beyond China, across from Kansu, there is a country with many mountains called Silla. It abounds in gold. Muslims who happen to go there were fascinated by the good environment and tend to settle there for good. There is no way of knowing what lies beyond there. Beyond China, there is a country abounding in gold called Silla. Muslims who advance there, captivated by its congenial surroundings, tend to settle there for good and do not think of leaving the place. The second Muslim scholar who mentioned the settlement of the Muslims in Korea after Ibn Qurdaba was Ibn Rushda. In Catalogue of Precious Goods, he wrote with little explanation that beyond China there is a country called Silla which abounds in gold, and that Muslims once settled there. Do not think of leaving. His expressions is similar to Ibn Qurdaba General Survey of Roads and Kingdoms concerning Silla. Like Yaqubi ibn al-Faqih, Kadama, Jahiz, Yad Hajan, and the like, Ibn Rushda seem to have been very much influenced by the writings of Ibn Qurdabin. There are more detailed and factual accounts on Muslims living in Silla in two writings by Masudi, The Golden Step and Gem Mines, and Learnings and General Survey, published 1 century later, following general survey of reading and kingdoms, Masudi identified the Muslims living in Silla, and according to him, some of them were Iraqis. Across the coast of China, not much is known except for Silla and its accompanying islands. Iraqis and some other foreigners settled there, choosing the place as their homeland. They do not intend to leave the place because of its fresh air, clean water, fertile earth, prospect for the increase of profit and income, rich minerals, and rich gems. Those who leave the place are quite few. So that's from UNESCO. For those of you who are paying attention, you would have seen that there was a mention of Al Masudi. Now, the reason I didn't bring him up first was because he's not the earliest to write about this area, but he does mention it. And we can read here, because of course they said Silla was the name of Korea. And we will read here. There are wonderful accounts reported respecting the Sea of China and those which are in connection with it. We refer the reader to our books on these subjects, which we have frequently had occasion to bring under his notice. Beyond the coast of China is no other kingdom known or described excepting the country of Es-Sabal, Japan, and Es-Silla, Korea, and the islands which belong to it. No one from Iraq or any other place of the West frequents this country. The air of this country is wholesome, the water good, the soil fertile, and the precious stones are brilliant and genuine. Hence the country is rich, and it seldom happens that the inhabitants leave their native soil. They are allies of the Chinese, and the kings of both countries constantly exchange presents. So you'll notice there, it's not a slight understanding of Korea. This is a very deep understanding of Korea. And of course, like I showed you, Al Masudi, Ibn Battuta, and many others say that one of the, so on one side, the friendliest people of China are the Koreans, and then on the other side, another trade partner are the Sudan, basically the Zanj and the Abyssinians. This makes it the center of both of these places in terms of trade. And you will see writings about wood and stuff being transported and all this other stupid stuff. But that's not important right now. One thing they do mention, though, is the difference between the boats that existed at the time, because Abyssinian boats and Zanj boats, a lot of the time, were built without nails because of corrosion. And, it was different for these other places. But this is the conclusion here. This early, they knew about Japan and, in fact, went to Japan. Isolated incidences, it didn't make a big difference in the history of Japan, but they did go there. But something to keep in mind, which is very important, is that these writings are before Genghis Khan was even born. So these connections are not made because of the Mongols. In fact, the Mongols had never ventured beyond their areas, still being pushed back by the Chinese. And, obviously they went into China sometimes and broke in, but there were still just these tribes in those areas. The Muslims had penetrated far into Japan and Korea. And remember, just like we see giraffes in China, pictures, paintings of giraffes in China, and of course, exploration that would later happen by Zheng He. But remember, Zheng He is still later. He's not necessarily an example of the people who inspired the Abyssinians and the Zanj to go and trade with China. And so this is something they thought of themselves. So this is why it's not a surprise that by the time of the kingdom of Mozambique, and remember Mozambique, I'm not talking about the Portuguese side of it. By the time of the kingdoms of Sena, the kingdom of Kilwa, the kingdom of Manigena, the kingdom of all these places that are Bantu regions, we find these Chinese pottery in this place. But this connection, though the Muslims write about it in the 900s, is actually earlier. Now, why would I say that? Well, it's because, they've dated the dates of some of these pottery, Chinese made pottery, that this is not a version of what would have been there, but they have it and it's in writing, and it's from the 7th century in Mozambique. Now, assumptions before first thought that it must have traveled from China to India to the Middle East, from Egypt to Mogadishu, from Mogadishu to the Swahili coast, from the Swahili coast to Mozambique. That's not what happened. It's easier today to believe that it went from China to the Zanj regions, including Mozambique directly, as that would be one of their trade partners. Unfortunately, because Mozambique at the time, in the 7th century, did not have any writing, it means that we will never fully understand what they saw. Who gave them these items? Was it literally these pale skinned Chinese people getting off of boats and trading with them? And for what exactly? I mean, we do know because we have it in Chinese records, but we don't know from the point of view of the people of Mozambique. You know, China tends to generalize East Africa. They don't tend to separate, but we do know that the word Zanj appears in Chinese records over and over again, meaning that they did deal directly with the Zanj when it came to trade. Remember, the word Zanj is just another word for Bantu people, but it's not all Bantu people. It's the Bantu people living in East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique, Zambia, those regions. It's hard to know what the original people thought about what they saw, but later fragments would continue to come in, even into the later centuries. And so we read the later fragments of the Chinese. So it says here the minority categories of Chinese porcelain shards recovered can be placed in the early Qing period dating to the 17th and 18th century CE, and the late Qing period, 18th and 20th century CE, in the same archaeological context of Convent Sao Dimago. Was also found a variety of European tin glazed earthenware, such as blue on white and blue and green on gray, with a variety of decorative motifs, and blue or green transfer printed whiteware. The chronological and geographical distribution of the Chinese and European ceramics on Mozambique Island present key patterns within regional trade history. In the early phase of this trade, the 15th and 16th century, the most dominant ceramics seem to be Chinese porcelains, and are commonly associated with the global Sino-Swahili trade network. In the later period, the importation of European ceramics become more common, also involved the export of ivory, enslaved people, gold, timbers, pearls, seed pearls, ambergris, tortoise shells, animal skins, and local potteries to Portugal and other Western European countries and their Northern American colonies, which I think is a very important thing to talk about, to remember that before that, before the Europeans arrive, you don't see any ceramics from Europe. Zilch, zero. And then they arrive, you start to see them replace the Chinese ones, meaning that, as they write, it was a global Sino-Swahili trade network. Very important. While paintings that depict Chinese people holding giraffes with these long necks and everything, and you can see that they have full contact with these animals. So this is not speculation. They actually traded them. While this is fascinating in proving it, this is not the best thing they got from Africa. Africans had gold at the time, so they traded gold with the Africans for ceramics and other things. And of course, the animals were crazy to them. Like, how is this possible that there's animals that look like this that you do not find in China? So, in conclusion, I actually want you in your head to imagine the scenario. And I think this perfect drawing, who I don't know who made it, but it's from the internet, will depict what type of world there was. You can see in the corner, there's an Arab man staring at this African man who's holding a giraffe, and then there's obviously a king from China standing behind. And this is a perfect image because it tells you and it shows you how different the cultures, but when they come together, how, I don't know, awesome it might have looked in the heads of many. And we know this happened. This scenario, even though it's a modern painting, we know it absolutely happened because Ibn Battuta writes about it. Ibn Battuta writes about Africans who are literally in China while there are Muslims there, while there are, what you call that, while there are Chinese people, obviously, because they're native to China, in China. So, and by the way, this is before the Portuguese ever were involved in any of this. No Europe, none of that, just straightforward. Now, I'm not saying there are no Muslim Europeans who traveled early. That did happen. I'm just saying it wasn't Europe proper. It wasn't colonizing Europe that took over Africa and all of that. This is prior to all of that. The world, it didn't seem obvious what direction the world was going. And I wish there was a painting of this type where it showed all the cultures in one region. Except there is, obviously, with that Chinese one that I showed you, where the Chinese one shows Western empires. But that's not important for this video.
Assalamu alaikum everybody, welcome to this new Arabic lesson with me.
In Islam, it was customary to free slaves once they were born of a father who was Muslim and a mother who was a heathen, provided that the mother converted to Islam. So there were many freed slaves living amongst the Arabs at the time. This is why we find so much DNA in Arabia that comes more recently in those areas. So many freed black people who find themselves in position of power abandon the natives of their people. But in this case, it does not happen. Al-Jahiz, being one of the most well-learned people, in fact, he's probably one of the most revered scholars in the Islamic world because of his extensive knowledge in various subjects. But one subject he knew more than any other because of his background was of the race, the black race. And so when he was challenged by Arabs who said that he was a black person and black people were pretty low on the totem pole, he decided that he was going to write a book in rebellion, telling them about why he believes that the black races are more fit of human than any other. He is one of the first scholars in history to stand up against anyone for the black race. In the name of the Almighty, merciful God, May God protect and keep you. Let he make you obey him and make you part of his favorites. You mentioned, may Allah protect you from the deception, that you read my treatise on the refutation of the pure Arabs to those of mixed parentage, the replies of the mixed ones and the answers of their maternal uncles. But I did not mention in it anything about the boasts of the Sudan. So know, may Allah preserve you, that I postponed that intentionally. And you mentioned that you would like me to write to you the boasts of the Sudan. So I have written what I recall of their boasts. Al-Asma, I said, Al-Fizr, a slave of the Fazara, who had a pierced earlobe, is known to have said, harmony arrives quickly in the creation because of the goats. Stay away from the sheep as long as there are goats around. The lamb avoids the predators and also does not feel close to the ones with big hooves. Abu Zaid al-Nawi recited the following verse. Without harmony, man perishes. Saddad al-Hariti, with erudite eloquence, tells, I requested from a black slave of the desert steppe, to whom do you belong, O black one? To the Lord of Hadar, O bold person? Aren't you black? Aren't you a bold person? Does truth thus puts you in so much anger? It is this truth which puts you in so much anger. Do not insult and you will be dreaded. Really best is then you give it up completely. So over here we get a glimpse of what life was like back then, especially given the fact that this book is written before 1000 AD. This is very, very early in the history, and he's already saying the person that he's addressing is a black person. And then not only that, he is a black person. This tells me that there's a lot of black people living in this region, and a lot of them are of Zanj history and freed slaves, because again, I told you, the free people of the Arabians would be the sons of slave women, which, as calculated by historians, the slave women, which they put in their harems, way outnumbered the men. And you will see that there are several slaves who rose to prominence. For example, Malik Amber. Malik Amber was a Ethiopian-born Oromo person who was taken as a slave by the Arabs and was sold to another person of Abyssinian heritage whose name was Genghis Khan. This is not Genghis Khan, this is Genghis Khan. He himself was also an Ethiopian slave. What happened is, in India, you would be a slave until your master dies, then you were freed. And a lot of these people ended up working somewhere in the high courts. And Malik Amber is one of them. Malik Amber became a sultanate of the Amagna. On the death of the Abyssinian who had controlled him, his wife freed him. And so he rose in rank, slowly teaming up with people, and then was regent for a while. On the death of the Abyssinian who had controlled him, his wife freed him. And so he rose in rank, slowly teaming up with people, and then was regent for a while. This image is a powerful image, and it shows how Malik Amber took advantage of other chiefs around and cemented his own power. So let's look at Murtaza Nizam Shah II. By the way, this image shows Murtaza, who is the guy in light blue. Then it shows Malik Ambar in black, and then it shows the Persian wife of Murtaza there in the back. And you can see they're all dressed in traditional Indian attire. So it says, born 1580, he was originally given the name Ali at birth. His father, Shah Ali, was a younger son of Burram Nizam Shah I. Following the fall of Chand Bibi in 1600, the former Sultan Bahadur Nizam Shah was captured and imprisoned by the Mughal prince Danial. The military commander Malik Ambar chose to use this power vacuum to strengthen his own power. Aware of his limited resources at the time, he sought out a member of the ruling family to use as a unifying symbol among the populace. Though all the royal children had been taken captive by Mughals, Malik Ambar discovered the 20-year-old Ali residing in Paranda. Though Ali's father, Shah Ali, was still alive at that point at 8 years old, he was viewed as a less preferable potential monarch in comparison to his son. Malik Ambar approached Ibrahim Adil Shah II, with whom the younger prince had taken refuge in Bijapur, to ask for permission for Ali to accept the crown. However, Shah Ali was hesitant to give his own approval to the proposal. Mistrustful of the commander's promises to safety for his son, to inspire confidence in the old prince, Malik Ambar offered to give his daughter in marriage to Ali. I think that sentence is supposed to say, to give his own daughter in marriage to Ali. Shah Ali agreed, and the young prince married the daughter in an elaborate ceremony before being raised to the throne with the name Murtaza Nizam Shah II. Malik Ambar, under his new official position as prime minister and regent, made Paranda the new capital and did much to restore stability to the kingdom. However, over the years, the Sultan began to chafe under the regency. When a truce was established between Ahmadnagar and the Mughals, Murtaza became offended by the development. He endorsed a rival of Malik Ambar, Raju Dukhani, which resulted in a lengthy war between the two nobles. Murtaza continued to intrigue and form factions against Malik Ambar, instigating a number of rebellions against him. Ambar grew frustrated with the Sultan's duplicity and sought the advice of Ibrahim Adil Shah II, who disapproved of having Murtaza deposed. Ibrahim intervened on behalf of the Sultan and restored relations between the two for the time. However, in 1610, another more serious quarrel occurred when Murtaza's Persian wife from an earlier marriage became embroiled in a verbal altercation with Malik Ambar's daughter. The former referred to her co-wife as a slave girl to the Sultan and the regent himself as a rebel. Ambar's daughter complained to her father, who in anger had both Murtaza and his wife poisoned by his secretary. Murtaza's 5-year-old son, who was either his child by the Persian wife or by Malik Ambar's daughter, was subsequently enthroned under the name Burhan Nizam Shah III. From 1600 to 1626, Malik Ambar increased the strength of the power of Murtaza Nizam Shah II and raised a large army. He raised a cavalry which grew from 150 to 7,000 in a short period of time and revitalized the Amagna Sultanate by appointing puppet sultans to repel Mughal attacks from the north. By 1610, his army grew to include 10,000 Habshis, which are Abyssinians or Ethiopians, and 40,000 Decanis. Over the course of the next decade, Malik Umbar would fight and defeat Mughal emperors Jahangir's attempts to take over the kingdom. Jahangir considered Malik Umbar his arch nemesis and had publicly expressed his anger towards him. He criticized Umbar as the ill-starred and black-fated Abdul Hassan, a chief painter at the Emperor Jahangir's court, has created painting under Jahangir's commission in 1615 depicting Jahangir shooting arrows at the severed head of Umbar. Malik Umbar changed the capital from Paranda to Jannar and founded a new city, Khadki, which was later on changed to Aurangabad by the Prince Aurangzeb in 1650 when he was viceroy of Deccan. Malik Umbar defeated the Mughal general Khan Kanan many times and often attacked Ahmadganj, Lukaji, Ladgavar, Malorji Basole, Shahaji Boshale, Ranoji Wable, and other Maratha chiefs had gained great prominence during this period. With the help of these Maratha chiefs, Malik Umbar had captured Ahmedganj fort and town from the Mughals, but in one of the battles, Malik Umbar was defeated by the Mughals and had to surrender the fort of Ahmedganj. Many Maratha chiefs, and especially Lukuji Jadavrawa, joined the Mughals after this. Shah Jahan once again laid a crushing blow to Malik Umbar in one of the battles and further decreased his power. He died in 1626 at the age of 77, which is a good age for any time. Fateh Khan succeeded his father as the regent of Nizam Shahs. However, he did not possess his predecessor's political and military prowess. Through a series of internal struggles within the nobility, which included Fateh Khan's assassinating his nephew Sultan Burhan Nizam Shah III, the Sultanate fell to the Mughal Empire within 10 years of Umbar's death. One of his daughters was married to a prince of Ahmedganj royal family, who through Malik Umbar's aid was crowned as Sultan Murtaza Nizam Shah II. The eldest and youngest daughters, respectively, were called Shahar Bano and Aziji Bano, the later of whom married a nobleman named Sidi Abdullah. His younger daughter was married to a Caucasian commander of the Ahmadganj army under the Mughal Empire and received the title Rustam Khan Bahadur Firoz Jung. Knowing that Ethiopians have been traveling the seas for this long, the Indian Ocean, we have to put it into context, everything we just read. And so I will read again for you guys something I read, but it was an hour thing, so some of you must have missed it. This is about India, the Indian Ocean, and this is what they have to say. This is by the way, this is 900 AD, so it's very old. When a great storm comes on, black figures rise from the water about 4 or 5 spans long, and they look like little Abyssinians. They mount on the vessels, but however numerous they may be, they do no harm. When sailors observe them, they are sure that a storm is near, for their appearance is a certain sign of a galley. So this tells you that Abyssinians have been around the Indian China Sea at least since 800 AD, but we know they go back further than this. Reputation of free Ethiopian men who guard the seas is repeated by Ibn Battuta, a couple hundred years later, after that book that I read, which is The Meadows of Gold, he says, "We embarked on the ship belonging to Ibrahim mentioned above, called Al-Jager. On this ship we put 70 of the horses of the sultans present, and the rest we put with the horses of our companions on the ship belonging to the Ibrahim's brother, called Manut Jalasi, gave us a vessel on which we put the horses of Zahar al-Din and Sunbul and their party. And he furnished it for us with water, provisioned and foraged. He sent his son with us on a ship called Ul-Kari, which resembled a grab but is rather broader. It has 60 oars and is covered with a roof during battle in order to protect the rowers from arrows and stones. I myself went on board Al-Jager, which had a complement of 50 rowers and 50 Abyssinian men at arms. These latter, which means the Abyssinians, are the guarantors of safety on this sea. Let there be but one of them on a ship, and it will be avoided by the Indian pirates and idolaters." I don't want to give you the impression that Arabs and Abyssinians have always been opposed to each other, especially during the Christian era. This is an example of Christian Abyssinia going against Islam Yemen. It says, "They were true believers, professing the unity of God, and did not belong to the Christian creed of this age. Shocked at these cruelties, a man of a name of Du-Thelaban went to Caesar to ask him for his aid. The emperor wrote to the Najashi, which is the king of Abyssinia, about the case as he was nearer. This gave origin to the invasion of Abyssinians in Yemen, who kept this country in subjection till Yusuf du Yusan solicited the assistance of several kings, which was at last granted to him by Anushirwan." And then, of course, there's Bilal ibn Riba, who was an African slave who was emancipated when Abu Bakr paid his ransom upon Muhammad's instructions. He was appointed by Muhammad as the first official Muezzin. In his book, Ibn Battuta praises Bilal, and it says, "Mu'imwa, the commander of the faithful, the grave of Bilal, Muezzin of the apostle of God. God bless and give him peace, and be pleased with them all, and those of Was al-Karini and Kabal Akbar."
Stuff like that on land most of the time. But the Somalians themselves and the Chinese went to each other's lands. But keep in mind, this is not a vast amount of people. This is a small amount of people who keep going back and forth for trade reasons.
Just as a reminder, although imported ceramics to Southern Africa and the Cape is part of our history, African ceramics are, of course, diverse in style, and we have a long, long history spanning thousands of years of beautiful, innovative ceramic objects that have been made in Africa. And I've chosen the Knox sculpture, which is so iconic. And of course, many members would know the Leidenburg heads, the 7 Leidenburg heads, of which one is illustrated here, from Leidenburg in the present-day Mpumalanga province. And I've also chosen a domestic vessel, beautifully decorated with arrows and zigzag patterns, also from the Mpumalanga area, but from 1946. So this is just to tell us, to remind us that we have this very, very rich history in Africa. Asian trade ceramics, of course, arrived before colonial times, and I've selected a few shards from the Izika collection. They were collected in the Zimbabwe area. They were not scientifically excavated, but we have them in our collection. They arrived in the collection in the late 19th century. There is the Chinese Celadon fragment, Persian ceramic fragments, and underglaze blue porcelain fragments from the Yuan to the Ming dynasties. So, of course, Africa was very much connected to the Indian Ocean world, and archaeological excavations at ancient trading sites such as Mapungubwe and Great Zimbabwe has proven that we've had those connections going back many years.
When we talk about ancient trade routes like the Silk Road, we forget that the Silk Road was extended so far and wide as to touch the southern tips of Africa. And like those great civilizations that are in Africa, pre-colonial civilizations, we find things in China that were made in Africa, such as golden ornaments and coins with Africans on them. Also, in China, there are depictions of dark-skinned people, and a lot of these people are thought to have moved or have been moved in through the Middle Eastern trade routes that linked Africa to East Asia. Now, some people believe that Africans founded the dynasties of China. This is not what this is about. I'm not going to claim something like that. To me, that's kind of outrageous, especially given the fact that some of the civilizations in Africa do not predate these Chinese civilizations. But it's obvious that the Chinese were very familiar with the direction of the Africans because there are maps drawn up by Chinese people which depict the African continent. And not only that, they depict African people, as you see in these figurines, pretty accurately. And they know which direction they come from. They even have names for these people. And these are different than the native black people which are around Asia. These people are specifically known because of their direction and where they fit on the map and where they came from. This map depicts 3 areas. One is Japan, parts of Japan. The other is Asia, wholly Asia. The other is Africa, and it shows parts of Eurasia. Interestingly, Europe is completely left out. Now, Kunyun or Kunlun was the name that they gave to African slaves or Africans, but then they started associating it with African slaves. And there's even a book that is about a slave that becomes an immortal that was written in ancient China and was revised in the 1500s and became how he became an immortal.
当我们想到古代中国时，许多人认为它是一个文化上与世隔绝的地方。在我们印象中，古代中国人以他们的技术、艺术、文学为傲，不关心外部世界。当然，丝绸之路促进了一定程度的文化交流，虽然这个时期的对话者多来自中亚、日本、韩国和东南亚。但是中国与黑人的接触呢？古代中国人对黑人的了解是可信的吗？根据历史资料，好像他们确实是了解的。今天我们将讨论古代中国人眼中的黑人，以及非洲人在中国领土上的第一个有纪律的证据。
中国文献中最早涉及黑人的是公元前5世纪莫迪的著作。莫迪在他的哲学论集《墨子》中区分了一些人和其他人，一些人指的就是黑人。稍后的著作《山海经》里，黑人被描述为有着虎头鸟足的生物，然而这说的都不是非洲人。 黑不过是指华夏帝国周边的蛮夷之族。直到很晚，我们才开始看到一些参考文献中的黑人，指的是非洲人。昆仑人作为一个新的人种分类，逐渐地被用于描述有着黑色皮肤的外国人。这个词开始被广泛使用，是在公元7世纪，广州都督陆元瑞被一个据说是马来西亚后裔的外国商人所杀之后。唐宋年间，昆仑的疆域被认为不仅包括东南亚，甚至远至非洲东海岸。昆仑代表了一大批不同种族的外国人。从12世纪的作家朱玉的作品中，我们可以看到昆仑人之间的区别。在他的《平洲可谈》一书里，记载了一种昆仑人比任何其他的人种都要强壮。在他的笔下，这种昆仑人有红色的嘴唇、白色的牙齿和墨黑的皮肤，而且他们是被阿拉伯商人带来的，一般被卖给广州地区富贵家庭做佣人。学者们认为这些昆仑人就是非洲人，但是我们怎么知道这是真的？1930年，中国学者张新良写了一本书，追溯到唐朝，证明了昆仑一词曾被用作一个广义的术语，但是对于特定的人群，更专业的术语是层期。这两个词是阿拉伯语中 zinj 在中文里的音译，本意为黑。这是昆仑人被阿拉伯商人作为货物带到中国最清楚的证据。
As easy as it should be to spot the difference between an African and a Chinese person, there's still a hangover of who or when Black Africans landed in China. The earliest we do know is that it must have been East Africans who actually have wrote about those areas, including places like ancient Egypt, which were aware of places very, very far away. Somewhere in 200 BC and going forward, the emperors and adventurers of China thought of going to a place which they called Dachin, which means second China. This place is thought to have been Greece or Rome. When they traveled that direction, they found it impossible to get there, especially since there were so many merchants who had ulterior motives from the Middle East. The Middle East has always been familiar with Egypt, China, India, and Rome. Everybody else was in the outskirts, and so they were only partially aware of each other. One day, the Chinese finally made it to Dachin, and they depict all kinds of narratives about the Romans and the Greeks. They too observed ancient Egyptians, or Egyptians at that time, and noticed that there were people of extremely dark color. Later on, as the story goes on, we have people like Alexander and the Islamic merchants who became way more familiar or familiarized the Chinese way more with darker skinned people. Now, these darker skinned people were different than other darker skinned people which they're familiar with, which were the Indians. Even the Indians were shocked by the appearance of the Africans, though there are other people around India that have that appearance. But to know that it was so abundant in other places was a shock. In the court of Kublai Khan, after Genghis Khan and his dynasty that lasted a very short time, but expanded far and wide, Kublai Khan found himself somewhere close to Europe. And in his court we have depictions of Europeans, mainly from Rome, and we also have depictions of Africans, black Africans. Luckily, these places did not fall under the reign of Kublai Khan. In fact, Kublai Khan dynasty, his entire lineage crawled all the way back to China. Finding out that the world was so big was one of the biggest things ever. In the 1200s, the Khans did damage, but in the 1300s, the information that the Khans had kept was a curiosity to the Chinese. And so they wondered, how big is the world really? And so Zheng He traveled all the way to East Africa to find out.
郑和前3次的航行到了越南、爪哇和斯里兰卡以及印度，只有1413年的第4次航行中，他才间接地抵达了非洲。那是在伊朗的霍尔木兹海峡，郑和见到了来自索马里首都摩加迪沙的商人。然而，对于郑和和他的同行者，这次见面最神奇的地方在于，他们有机会看到长颈鹿，一种他们从没见过的生物。1414年，郑和的船队带着长颈鹿和几个非洲的自由人返回中国，以向皇帝朝贡。1417年，郑和船队的第5次远航在非洲登陆。位于非洲东海岸的这些航行，最权威的记录来自于随军翻译官费信。他虽然不是郑和船队里热情的追随者，但他提供了关于这群人航行最准确、最有启发性的记录。同样重要的是，这些记录帮助我们了解中国人怎么看待15世纪东非人的生活。
This is Siyu village, located in the northeast of Kenya. Legends among local people speaks of a story that more than 600 years ago, survivors from a sunken Chinese ship found their way here and married to the local beauties. People who live in the house you're seeing behind me was proved to have Chinese genetics.
According to legends, a team of Chinese sailors survived a shipwreck in the Indian Ocean waters and settled in Lamu Island. Historians contend that the sailors were part of a fleet sent by the legendary Chinese navigator Zheng He. 6 centuries later, the descendants of these Chinese sailors are visible in Lamu, where China's ancient maritime Silk Road terminates. In Siyu village, archaeologists have discovered artifacts like porcelain and coins that were symbols of the Ming dynasty.
This is some pieces of Chinese porcelain here. When I walk around, you will meet these things. There are many steel pieces. When you walk around, you'll see the small pieces. So this is, I found it here in Siyu.
Mwamaka and her family are among the ones who are a living testimony of the earliest contacts between Kenya and China. It was in 2002 that a team of distinguished Kenyan and Chinese researchers carried a DNA analysis on Mwamaka's 63-year-old mother and discovered that she has Chinese genetics.
They came and we welcomed them first day, and they took some hair of us for texting to ensure that we are one of them.
Soon afterwards, the Chinese government offered Mwamaka a scholarship to study Chinese traditional medicine in China. Kenyan and Chinese archaeologists have been tracing evidence of ancient contacts in the Kenyan coast. They hope to find the shipwreck to help unearth all artifacts symbolizing ancient cultural and trade ties.
Before the Europeans first landed in India, there was a kingdom that was ruled there and was a Muslim empire. It was the empire of Bengal, the Bengal Sultanate. Prior to this, there were other people who ruled. But first, let's talk about this date, May 20, 1498. That's when the first Europeans landed in India. Before this day, every other race in the old world had reached India and had basically cemented themselves in these regions. Now, Bengal is just at the far side of India, meaning that anyone who went this far could probably easily know about any other place in the East. So we're talking about Korea, we're talking about Japan, China, and all the other places. But the people I'm going to talk about would definitely know about them because they were in charge. This was the time that the Abyssinians would be in charge of a Indian majority region, putting in place their own people in high positions and making it easy for themselves to remain in power, dynasty after, well, king after king after king. Though their rule didn't last that long, it still shows how cemented or how infused the Abyssinians were at this time with the Indian continent. And remember, this is before any Europeans had ever landed in India, at least in any significant way. They had heard about it. They had gotten messages. They had seen all kinds of people who were talking about the spices and the silks and all of that. But then to land there and have significant contributions to the subcontinent, that was not going to happen. Not for a while. But Abyssinians, on the other hand, not only played a small role, but played a large role. And like I said, they played administrative positions in several different ways. At one point, being a chain. So before the Sultanate of Bengal, there was three kingdoms that were fighting for power: the Gauda Empire, the Pala Empire, and the Sena Empire. These empires, the Pala being the biggest, are something of great interest, but we shouldn't speak about them today because they have a long history and they were native, meaning that they were people who already were in this region. So the Abyssinians and the Persians who would take over were definitely not native. Now, how Persian was this empire? Well, consider this: Persian was considered the official language of this, this colony of Persia. So they were definitely the biggest controller. And in fact, the people who came before the Abyssinians were Persians, and the people who came after them were also Persians. It is quite the interesting story. So what do we have? We have names, we have last names, not clues. We're not going to show you a giraffe. I'm not going to show you, a llama. I'm not going to show you some animal and say, there you go. I'm talking about a real person. For example, Shahzada Barbark. Shahzada Barbark was known by his regional title as Ghiyasuddin Barbark Shah, and he took over the kingdom of Bengal after a Persian. He got rid of the Persian by getting rid of him, sending him to heaven, and he decided that it was his time to rule as someone who was in a position to rule. So during the reign of Jalaluddin Fateh Shah of the Bengal Muslim Ilyas Shahi dynasty, some Abyssinian eunuch slaves ended up in important and influential positions in the royal court, many as pikes. Barbark was a eunuch and was one of the increasingly powerful of the Abyssinian palace guards. Eventually being promoted to commander of the palace guards, he led a rebellion against Sultan Fateh Shah and killed him. Shahzada Barbark took power in 1487 and started what was to become a Habshi dynasty of rulers in Bengal. He assumed the title Shahzada. Few coins have been discovered bearing his name. His reign was short-lived, being murdered by another Abyssinian. The Abyssinian who took him out was Malik Andil Habshi. His one is a little on the nose because Habshi is in his name. Better known as his regional title, Saifuddin Firoza Shah, a Habshi. Andil was an army commander of the Ilis Shahi dynasty who seized power after killing the rebel Sultan Barbak Shah II. In 1487, after claiming the throne, he styled himself as Saifuddin Firuz Shah. It is said that Andal was a eunuch. Now, we're not sure about that. He is often considered as the real founder of the Habshi rule in Bengal, as the previous Shahzada Barbark only ruled for a few months, which is probably not fair. I mean, he did start it. This is reinforced in an inscription found in Gar Jaripa in Sri Bardi Sherpa, where he ordered the construction of someone's tomb and referred to himself as Sultan al-Ahad, the first sultan. The four corners of the specific tomb each bore the names of Rashidun caliphs, and the inscription sent blessings upon the Islamic prophet Muhammad, his daughter Fatima, and her two sons, Hassan and Hussein. This inscription now can be found in the Indian Museum Kolkata. Firuz Shah minted coins during his reign, which mentions the historical town of Mahmudabad. Now, we could talk about this guy because he is, I mean, you can see there that building, the Firoz Minar in Goada. He is known as a great builder. Like, he erected giant buildings that are still there today in that region. The next one is Mahmud Shah, a adopted son, because obviously the previous one was probably a eunuch, an adopted son of the previous sultan, and he ruled for a while as well. Now, there's no information about him on Wikipedia because the geniuses of Wikipedia put in a different Mahmud Shah who is from the 1300s. But after Mahmud Shah, there is Sidi Badr. Now, Sidi is obviously the name of what they call black people in, the Indian regions. So Sidi Badr was born to a Muslim family of Habshi descent, intending to take over Bengal. He first killed Habash Khan, the regent of the young Sultan Mahmud Shah II, before proceeding to also kill the Sultan Badr, ascending the throne under the title of Shams. He developed an army of 40,000 soldiers, recruiting thousands of Afghans and 5,000 Abyssinians. In 896 AH or 1490 AD, he constructed a mosque in Gangarampur adjacent to the Dargah of Makdum Maulana Atta. On 30 December 1492, his governor, Khurshid Khan, established a Jama mosque near Nawabganj on the banks of the Mahananda River. He defeated the Kamata kingdom in the battle and conquered their territory in the year 898 AH, and subsequently issued coins bearing Kamata Mandam 898. On the 2nd July 1493, the Sultan constructed a building near Dargah of Nur Qutub Alam in Hazrat Pandua. His wazir, chief minister Sayyid Hussain, led a rebellion in which he was killed. Hussain succeeded as the Sultan in 1498, assuming the name Alauddin Hussain Shah, and founded the Hussainid Shahi dynasty of Bengal. He also removed all Habshis from administrative posts, ending the Habshi rule. Now you can see how formidable and how straight up these Habshis were. A lot of them were slaves given the chance to rise, and they rose pretty well. I mean, talk about using merit over anything else. They just worked their way up to the top, and when they got there, they did what they had to do. Now, obviously, one thing that we could say why this dynasty didn't last that long, it was barely stable. You could not call it stable. Every single king in that list got assassinated. If you notice that, every single one of them got assassinated. But what do we expect when we're talking about people who, in their own way, were just a bunch of military men who were put in positions where, I mean, you start off as a bitter slave, you're then put in a higher position, and now you're in a position where you could control the nation. I don't think you're gonna be, well adjusted. Also, they took your, family jewels. You're not exactly gonna be the most well-adjusted human being. Now, as kings, they contributed a lot. Now, remember, contribution of a king doesn't just come in, oh, I just control the region for a short while. They erected buildings that are still there and are known by people, historians, that they were made by Abyssinians. Keep in mind the time, the date of these people. I mean, the last one who was in charge was pretty much at close to when the Europeans were going to come to India. We're talking about a very long time ago here. We're talking about, I mean, if you take, the year 2000 as the starting point, we're talking about 600 years before that. We're talking about the 1400s. By the way, I hope you guys are counting how many Abyssinian rulers I've talked about in India. So, just to give you a clue, we've got that dome with the Zanj. We have that area that had a swimming pool near the Burma-like areas. We now have the Bengal regions. And then we also had that guy who was married to that Persian woman who they didn't like. Those are the diverse regions that they ruled. People like talking about the Moors, but what about these Abyssinians who ruled faraway lands at about the same time as the Moors, really, at least the tail end? Now, as kings and as Muslims, they would have been aware of the highest architecture of the day, which is why they built a bunch of mosques in the regions. And of course, we can look at them, but let's do that another time. But then we have the second thing, which is they would have traded. They would have traded with China, Japan, Korea, all these places. We have direct contact with these Abyssinians and faraway lands, exotic places, they themselves being exotic. This is the world before the Europeans came, the real world, the world that was diverse and accepted diversity. Now, I cannot blame the Muslims, to be honest, for removing the Abyssinians because they realized, yeah, you're dealing with some real smart folks here. You better go back to the weak people who will let you rule. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea is a book that was written by an explorer from ancient Egypt, 1st century AD, and he wrote in Greek and wrote about the travels that a lot of people, including himself, had done, and he wrote as far as India and even China. Now, the problem with this is that China itself was somewhat ignorant of Africa and even Europe at this time, while Indian traders had been trading there since the 7th century BC. Evidence of Indians in Africa goes back years, centuries. And because of this, the Chinese were fully aware that there must have been other continents or even lands that lay beyond. So, from the perspective of the Chinese, they needed to know what is on the other side of the Middle East. Sima Qian, a historian from China from BC, 100 BC, describes all these fascinating places in the Middle East, but his descriptions stop at Dachin. And Dachin, which is thought to be Greece or Rome, is not explored. It's said as something that he has heard of from other people. But he did talk about traveling to close areas in the Middle East. Something that is not written in the Book of Simichin, which talks about the Western nations. Yezu, the people are settled on the land, cultivating the fields and growing rice and wheat. They also make wine out of grapes. They have walled cities like the people of Daiwan. The regions containing several hundred cities of various sizes. The kingdom, which borders the Gu River, is very large, measuring several thousand li squares. Some of the inhabitants are merchants who travel by carts or boats to neighboring countries, sometimes journeying several thousand li. The coins of the country are made of silver and bear the face of the king. When the king dies, the currency is immediately changed, and new coins issued with the face of his successor. The people keep records by writing horizontally on a strip of leather. To the west lies Tiazao, or Mesopotamia, and to the north Yangsai and Liashan, Hirakan, or the Turkish regions. Tiazao is situated several thousand li west of Angshi and borders the Western Sea, the Persian Gulf. It is hot and damp, and the people live by cultivating the fields and planting rice. In this region live great birds which lay eggs as large as pots. The people are very numerous and are ruled by many petty chiefs. The ruler of Angshi gives orders to these chiefs and regards them as his vassals. The people are skillful at performing tricks that amaze the eye. The old men of Angshi say they have heard that the Taozao are to be found in the river of the weak water and the Queen Mother of the West, though they admit that they have never seen either of them. Dakshia is situated 2,000 li southeast of Daiwan, south of the Gu River. Its people cultivate the land and have cities and houses. Their customs are like those of Daiwan. It has no great ruler, but only a number of petty chiefs ruling a various cities. The people are poor in the use of arms and afraid of battle, but they are clever at commerce. After the great Yezu moved west and attacked and conquered Dakshia, the entire country came under their sway. The population of the country is large, numbering some 1 million or some more persons. The capital is called the large city of Langshi or Bactra, and has a market where all sorts of goods are brought and sold. Southeast of Dakshia is the kingdom of Shendu or India. When I was in Dakshia, Shang Qian reported, I saw bamboo canes from Chong and cloth made in the province of Shu. When I asked the people how they had gotten such articles, they replied, our merchants go to buy them at the market of Shendu. Shendu, they told me, lies several thousand li southeast of Dakshia. The people cultivate the land and live much like the people of Dakshia. The region is said to be hot and damp. The inhabitants ride elephants when they go into battle. The kingdom is situated on a great river. We know that Dakshia is located 12,000 li southwest of China. Now, if the kingdom of Shendu is situated several thousand li southeast of Dakshia and obtains goods which are produced in Shu, it seems to me that it must not be very far away from Shu. At present, if we try to send envoys to Daxia by way of the mountain trails, the lead through the territory of the Qiang people, they will be molested by the Qiang, while if we send them a little further north, they will be captured by the Xiongnu. It would seem that the most direct route, as well as the safest, would be that out of Shu. Thus the emperor learned of Daiwan, Daxi, Anxi, and others, all great states rich in unusual products, whose people cultivate the land and made their living in much of the same way as the Chinese. All these states, he was told, were militarily weak and prized Han goods and wealth. He also learned that to the north of them lived the Yezu and Kangju, people who were strong in arms but who could be persuaded by gifts and the prospect of gain to acknowledge allegiance to the Han court. If it were possible to win over these states by peaceful means, the emperor thought, he could then extend his domain 10,000 li, attract to his court men of strange customs who would come translating and retranslating their languages, and his might would become known to all of the lands within the four seas. The emperor was therefore delighted and approved Shang Qian's suggestion. He ordered Shang Qian to start out from Juanwei in Shu on the secret mission to search for Daxia. The party broke up into four groups proceeding out of the regions of Meng, Ran, Shi, and Qiong and Po. All the groups managed to advance 1,000 or 2,000 li, but they were blocked on the north by the Di Zhao tribes, and on the south by the Sioux and Kunming tribes. The coming tribes have no rulers, but devote themselves to plunder and robbery, and as soon as they are seized, any of the Han envoys, they immediately murder them. Thus, none of the parties were ever able to get through to their destination. They did learn, however, that some 1,000 or more li to the west there was a state called Dianwei, whose people rode elephants, and that the merchants of Shu sometimes went there with their goods on unofficial trading missions. In this way, the Han, while searching for the route to Daxia, first came into contact with the kingdom of Dian. Earlier, the Han and had tried to establish relations with the barbarians of the southwest, but the expanse proved too great, and no road could be found through the regions, and so the project was abandoned. After Zhang Qian reported that it was possible to reach Daxia by traveling through the region of the southwestern barbarians, the Han once more began efforts to establish relations with the tribes in the area. Now, while that is an impressive amount of knowledge that Sima Qian shows, it's not new to the Chinese. The Chinese had known about Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, India, and other regions, I mean, as far as Japan, Korea, Indonesia, and all the rest by about the 7th century BC. So, and there's actually written records about this. So this isn't a revolutionary book. The thing that they were trying to do was to sum up what was happening so that they could go further than this point. Unfortunately, you can see right there that the people of the Middle East guarded their territory with all their might. And why would they do this? Why would they bother? Well, we do know that lying just on the other side of the Middle East, which the Chinese were fully ignorant of, are two great continents. These continents, of course, had been visited by the Indians, so the Indians were fully aware. And had the Chinese been more curious to ask the Indians how they made their way to these vast places, they would have had the knowledge greater than trying to walk through land, which probably seemed simpler at the time. But the two that lay on the other side were Africa and Europe. What would then happen after that is that explorers from China would try again and again and again to go beyond this area, failing a couple times. And of course, the Europeans would make their way into China very far back. In fact, there are Chinese books that go back about the same time as Sima Qian that talk about the the explorers of China landing, or the explorers of Europe landing in China. Or at least they call them explorers from the West. Maybe they were from Europe, who knows? They could have been from Egypt. Now, a couple things. Obviously, we can't take everything that the sources say to heart, including Herodotus and all of them. We can't take every single thing they say to the fullest because, of course, they may misinterpret things. For example, I think a lot of the civilizations which they say dedicate themselves to robbery would definitely say, if coming from their perspective, they were not robbers or thieves, but instead were capturing certain foreigners and stuff like that who would infiltrate their territories and then rob them, but they were doing commerce within each other, and that you can't really have a state that is dedicated to robbery. In the same way that Herodotus describes the people of Egypt when he's talking about them doing their dances as, they try to make the most offensive dances, and they start to show certain parts of their body and stuff like that in offensive manner. I think from the perspective of the Egyptians that he's writing about, they would definitely wouldn't say that that's what they were doing. Like, hey, we're trying to offend people. In real life, what was, because of course, who you gonna offend? They weren't doing it for the Romans; they were doing it for themselves. What they were really doing was just dancing, but the dance was so wild or unexpected compared to what the Greeks had seen that they describe it in a completely different manner. And this is one of the problems, and I'd say solutions, of history, in that it's a problem because obviously if you read one perspective, then you get one perspective, and then that's it, right? That's what you believe. But if you read multiple perspectives of the same encounter, what you then see is how other people see things that do not belong to their own customs. And of course, in ancient Egypt, they would consider themselves as highly organized, whereas Herodotus sort of shows that they're highly organized for the most part, but then starts to interpret things that he does not understand as chaos. Speaking of Herodotus, he is one of the great evidences that the people of India traded with Africa going far back. Because remember, in Herodotus's book, we have Indians stationed as close as the Red Sea, and we know in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea that Middle Eastern merchants would meet Indian boats at the Red Sea, which were trading with African boats. And we know during the Arabic times that the Arabs would allow Indian boats to trade with African boats unmolested. So, drawing a map of what is really happening, you can see that the country that is left out, or the continent, or whatever you want to call it, that is left out is not Africa. It's not even India. It's not Europe. It's not the Middle East. It's China. China, of course, still gaining a lot of the trade. I mean, rhino horns, we know, were making their way all the way to China, but this did not stop them from being completely ignorant of these places. And so we go to another Chinese person who too would fail to reach Africa or Europe. From the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, conceptualizing the far west, early Chinese notions of Dachin and the Indian Ocean trade. Now, it's important to understand that Dachin didn't necessarily mean Rome as it's been interpreted today, but in fact could be a mix of several Western civilizations, that Western meaning west of China, which they did not know about. So obviously they would know, like, okay, these people are from the Middle East because they've run into Middle Easterners. But in some cases, they would run into Africans, or they would run into a type of Middle Eastern group that they had never met before, the ones that don't represent Persian or those near regions. And because of this, they would make the estimation that these people come from Dachin. But remember, a lot of these would be guesses, and a lot of these people who wrote about Dachin were hundreds of years apart, so they did not know if they were talking about the exact same location. In some cases, they would even be talking about Roman Egypt. So the people come from Roman Egypt and they say, oh, these are the people from Dachin. What does that mean? As we read, conceptualizing the far west, early Chinese notions of Dachin and the Indian Ocean trade by Matthew A. Cobb. In the Liang Shu, a 7th century Chinese history primarily covering the period 502 to 557 CE, a curious incident is reported about the arrival of a merchant called Qin Lu on the coast of Jiazhou in 226 CE, a region equating to the Red River Delta in Vietnam. This merchant, who is said to have been from Da Chin, literally Great Chin, a term often interpreted by many modern scholars as referring to the Roman Empire, was sent by the prefect of Jiaozi to the ruler Sun Xian, 222 to 252 CE, of the state of Wu, who was asked to provide a report on his native country and its people. After being gifted men and women, boys and girls, 10 of each, Qin Lu returned home. It is stated in the passage directly preceding this anecdote that the merchants from Daqin frequently visit Funan, a prefecture of the Mekong Delta, as well as Renan and Jizao. But few of the inhabitants of these southern frontier states have traveled to Daqin. If it is accepted that Daqin does in fact refer to the Roman Empire in this instance, and that this comment is directly connected to the anecdote about Qin Lun, then we would, on the face of it, appear to have testimonies of supposed frequent travel by merchants from the Roman Empire to the areas along the coast of what is today Vietnam during the early 3rd century CE, possibly also from the end of the 2nd century CE. However, this seems an unlikely proposition given our understanding of the levels of the direct participation by Roman merchants in the Indian Ocean trade at this time, as is clear from the intensity of the occupation of the key Egyptian Red Sea ports. Now, there is a greater context to this reading as to the location of Daqin, so I will link it so that you guys can read it yourself. If you want to, comment 1. If you want me to read the whole thing, I'll just upload it as a full reading. I have it, but I'm not going to read it this time because I don't know what people want, but let's just see one of their conclusions about what Daqin is. The products of Daqin. Discussions of the products of Dachin perhaps has more pertinence with the regards to Indian Ocean trade. McLaughlin, working on the assumption that the Wheelie and How Hanshu faithfully reproduce information appearing in its original reports regarding these texts as being able to provide information about Roman products reaching the Far East. The former text associating Dachin with some 59 products, he even suggests that many of the goods, which are clearly from other regions such as Arabia and India, were reprocessed and re-exported items from Roman workshops. On the face of it, it might be tempting to accept this premise, at least in part, since some of the products listed in our Chinese text do in fact derive from the Roman Empire. These include gold, silver, various base metals, glass, red coral, asbestos, cloth, real gar, storax, orpiment, and saffron. A few of the products, like red coral, were in fact regarded across many cultures, while storax and glassware appear to have been particularly appreciated in China. It might even be tempting to give some credence to the claim made in the Waylay about the people of Dachin reworking imported Chinese silk and reselling it at a profit. This is because what seems to be corroborated evidence appears in a few Greco-Roman sources. Pliny mentions women of the empire dividing threads of silk and then reweaving them to make a lighter, more gauze-like fabric, a practice also briefly alluded in Lucian's Pharsalia. Furthermore, there is a reference to the edict of maximum prices to a variety of reworked silks, including dyed and embroidered products. However, there are reasons to be more circumspect in the case of the notions of reworking woven silk products. Hildebrandt observes that any such product would damage the fabric. She argues that instead Lucian may have alluded to a diaphanous, purple dyed silk grown or gown that was formerly a plissé fabric but stretched to make it transparent, and that Pliny was talking about the unraveling of cocoons, not woven fabrics. Furthermore, reasons for doubt also derives from the fact that Dachin need not automatically designate peoples from the Roman world. The existence of reasonably developed silk industry in India in the early historic period should at least give us pause about whether the claim made in the Waylay necessarily reflects accurate Chinese knowledge of Roman practices regarding silk processing with regard to the range of items listed as products of Dachin. Most of these, as noted, clearly derive from the regions such as East Africa, ivory, rhinoceros horn, southern Arabia, frankincense and myrrh, the Persian Gulf regions, pearls, India, Duna, rock crystal, pearls, ivory, carnelian, and Southeast Asia. Rather than attempt to claim that all of these items were repossessed and re-exported from the Roman Empire, it seems more plausible to suggest that they were conflated with Dachin as a powerful semi-utopian kingdom in the distant west, and that these authors were simply not in the position to clearly distinguish the origins of these products. This confusion and lack of clarity about the origin of particular imported products is not an unusual phenomenon. For example, there was a persistent and a erroneous belief repeated in Greco-Roman literature that cinnamon, cassia, and nard came from Arabia. It may also be possible to draw certain parallels with the list of products from Dachin, given in the Waylay and Ho Hanshu, with Buddhist ideas that made their way into China in Mahayana Buddhism. There is a concept of seven treasures. In the great event, an important Mayahan text, these seven consist of crystal or quartz, pearls, lapis lazuli, gold, silver, red coral, and agate or coral. Later texts substitute rubies or diamonds. These items became features of Buddhism. Heavens and also came to constitute elements of the immortal trees of Taoist paradise. All of these items are listed in the Wele with the exception of lapis lazuli, but these could be understood as being subsumed within the various semi-precious gems category. This appears similarly to be the case with the slightly less extensive list in the Hanshu. Before we finalize the last part of this reading, let's summarize what we've been reading, which is first of all, let's just look at the arguments which are solid, which are you can't conclude from the Chinese, who in the beginning we read had never even gone past the Middle East, that they know for a fact that the people that they're talking about are from the Roman Empire. Secondly, we can't conclude from this that there are other people who did not come from different regions and land. Now, Daqin meaning the Great Qin, which they're talking about, well, modern people interpret it as Rome or the Roman Empire. Here's the problem, many problems. One, these are several different times. So the Roman Empire shrank and grew and shrank and grew. So how could they know specifically which parts it was? But also the materials that came from several different locations. That came from India, China, well, India, Rome, Africa, the Middle East. How can you conclude that, and even Southeast Asia, how can you conclude that all of those were taken from the Romans? The answer couldn't be more clear. This is actually evidence of, if they are correct about what they're saying, this is evidence of multiple people traveling from multiple different places and entering China from Southeast Asia, which of course the Romans would have very little access to those regions, from Africa, from the Middle East, and from India by boat traveling. And in fact, this summarizes the Indian Ocean. And in fact, there's more writings about Dachin and what the people might have looked like, and the fact that some of them wore gold and all this other stuff, which we will not look at today. But still, there's more information about this. And that Dachin, that's been taken to mean the Roman Empire, because it later meant, those specific regions, especially with Justinian. Now, another thing that, I'm going to contradict a video I made recently, actually the previous one, is that it is possible that Justinian was the first to use the silkworm, but it's also possible that other people outside of Justinian's people figured out the silkworm because they traded with China directly. Okay, continue reading, which actually mentions bluish greenish gems, quite possibly referring to lapis lazuli. While Dachin was understood as a terrestrial empire, the fact that it was in the far west near the location where paradise was situated, at least in certain religious philosophical creeds like variants of Buddhism and Taoism, may explain why these products were associated with this empire. The suggestion is, of course, speculative. The next title heading is Dachin as a nebulous concept, and this is basically their conclusion. Given the contested debate in modern scholarship regarding exactly what Dachin refers to, and the fact that many mythic religious concepts are associated with it, we should consider questioning whether our Chinese authors had a precise, consistent, and coherent sense of this land. In consequence, this has obvious implications for the way in which we understand the reference to the merchant from Dachin frequently sailing to Vietnam, mentioned in the Liang Shu. The notion that a term that designates an other ethnic cultural group might be vague, imprecise, and fluid, open to being understood differently from context to context, should not be surprising. The type of problem has a number of historical parallels. For example, the term Yavana in origin appears to have been used in parts of India to designate Greek speaking peoples. It generally assumed that the Persian term for Ionians, Ioana, was transmuted into the Prakrit Yona and Sanskrit Yavana. However, by the early to mid-centuries of the first millennium CE, it appears to have become much broader in meaning, not necessarily just designating Greek speakers, and could be understood in different terms, as appears to be in the case of Sangam literature of the Tamil cultures, as well as inscriptional evidence from the Deccan and the island of Socotra. Similarly, the Greco-Roman designation of Ethiopians, a people that are broadly associated with Northeast Africa, could, depending on the period and the context, be associated with the Meroitic kingdom, or by the 3rd century, if not earlier, with the Aksum kingdom. Similarly, some authors, classical authors, conflate India and Ethiopia, and at least by the late antique period, the term India, sometimes distinguished between India Major and India Minor, could include regions like East Africa. This potential ambiguity should be borne in the mind when considering the description of Dachin and its people in textual sources. Now, the one I know the most about that they make there, the two of India Minor and India Major, where sometimes they refer to East Africa, but there's also the Mesopotamians who sometimes well, not sometimes, they definitely made the reference to some places which were India later as Africa, but I forgot the name of them. I'll look it up. But if you look at also Ethiopia, the word Ethiopia, though it meant East Africa in some cases, this was because they ran into those places first. But you will see that there are other Greco-Roman sources that call the Ethiopia the entire continent of Africa. In some cases, they call only the parts south of the north, obviously, as Ethiopia, and then the lands above, they have their own names, especially the parts that they had conquered. Also, sometimes they refer to Egypt as Ethiopia, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they say Ethiopia, not referring to Egypt or outside of Egypt. One author, one who was very ignorant, also claimed that the Ethiopians come from India and that there was a land somewhere in the middle of India and Africa, and they separated from that place. Now, obviously, knowing genetics today, it's a very ignorant thing to say, and was probably born of the fact that Indians and Africans have similar skin color. Back to the reading, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that Chinese historical texts, as has been discussed, usually followed their predecessors when describing foreign countries and situations. Indeed, it is of interest that the texts dating several centuries after the initial composition of the Wele and Honhanshu appear to transpose a number of ideas connected to Dachin, with Fulin, the latter usually being interpreted as referring to Byzantine, meaning some of the descriptions and designations repeated in later texts may represent fossilized ideas, which can become distorted in the process of conflation of earlier, sometimes more accurate, predecessors. This adds a further layer of complication when thinking about knowledge transfer and how much can genuinely be taken as reports that resulted from trade contacts. He goes on to say, ultimately, it is not my intention to claim that these early Chinese texts have no use in the study of Indian Ocean and South China Sea networks of exchange, commercial and cultural, of the early mid first millennium CE. However, I hope to have demonstrated that these reports need to be treated with a great deal of circumspection. Now, of course, Eastern sources aren't the only sources that we have. For Africa, we have, of course, Ptolemy, who wrote in his geography about Rapta and Aramata, where spices are taken and shifted around the world, which Aramata is in the Horn of Africa, Rapta is somewhere inside or in Central Africa or Central East Africa. It's never been found, but there are some clues to where exactly it is. We know it's not in the north. We know it's not too far to the south because they mentioned the Zanj regions after this, which are in the south. And this is what he had to say. Concerning the voyage from Aramata to Rapta, Marinus tells us that a certain Diogenes, one of those who were accustomed to sail to India, having been driven out of his course, and being off the coast of Aramata, was caught by the north wind, and after having sailed with Troglodytica on his right, came in 25 days to the lake from which the Nile flows, to the south of which lies the promontory of Raptum. He tells us also that a certain Theophilus, one of those who were accustomed to sail to Azania, driven from Rapta by the south wind, came to Aramata on the 20th day. In neither of these cases does he tell us how many days were occupied in the actual sailing, but merely states that Theophilus took 20 days and Diogenes, who sailed along the coast of Troglodytica, took 25 days. Now, I want to remind you that when we're talking about Rapta, we're not talking about any place outside of Africa, or even when we talk of Aramatica or Aramata, we're not talking about a place outside of Africa. We're talking about Africa proper. And there's a reason why I'm saying this. And the reason why I'm saying this is because there's so many references of geography, of location, that make it obvious where these locations are. For example, he mentions Arabia Felix, which is about Yemen. And from there, he says opposite that there's Aramatica or Aramata, which is in there. And then all of a sudden, he says you move westward, you get to Rapta. You move southwards, you get to the Zanj regions. So it's unlike the older version in Egypt when they mention the areas of the Horn of Africa, where they leave it up to interpretation, where some people have taken it to mean maybe Saudi Arabia or some other place. In this case, they mean definitely these specific locations. And the fact that they mention empires in those regions, stone walls, clothes being weaved in those regions, tells you how old the tradition is. But of course, this is not about clothes or any of that. It has to do with the connection between India and Dachin and all these other places in history that communicated with each other. Well, we can see here that there were some people from as far as Europe who did go to India. And of course, from the Chinese sources, we know that people from the West, meaning Africa, west of China, they did go to those regions. So we have multiple sources from multiple parts of the world that detail multiple people traveling multiple times from one place to the other. We even in this book of Ptolemy, we have them documenting boats traveling from Arabia Felix all the way into Rapta, and from Rapta to Arabia Felix. So probably the most annoying thing about this history is not that it is lost or unknown, it's that it's so easy to piece together, yet still people look at it like a vague, because of course when people say when did trade between India and Africa outside of Egypt start, they say about the 7th century. There's proof everywhere that that couldn't be the case and that it started somewhere. If you were being charitable to the other side, you would say 7th century BC. And of course, like I said, trade does not always mean you want stuff that you don't have in your own land, but instead you might value, for example, rhinoceros horns. Why are rhinoceros horns being taken there? Well, it might have to do with preserving their rhino instead of, getting rid of their rhino. If there's a bunch of people who are okay with getting rid of their rhino specifically, then they can keep the horns. Oh yeah, and finally I want to say about the silk thing. Like I said, I made a video about it saying that it was Justinian who brought it to these regions and probably brought it to Africa. But again, that's based on specific authors and specific people who say this. We do not know if the people did not discover it in some other way in India, the Middle East, or even Africa. So globalization might have been a thing way before we thought, and that we lost that at some point, but later we brought it back in the strongest way possible. Now, not every region in the world didn't globalize, but what I mean is Europeans. Now, again, the word frequent is a scary word because, of course, oh yeah, that was one of the points I wanted to make. One of the reasons why it seems like there was so many missions to China at the time could explain the fact that it was multiple people from multiple civilizations, and then they think it's a lot, they're coming there a lot of times, when in real life it's different civilizations. Thank you. Oh, subscribe, like, share, everything.